look at the sort of addictions that we talk about, and they all tend to be kind of morally loaded, or at least many of them tend to be kind of morally loaded. I mean, we talk a lot about like video game addiction, gambling addiction, of course, which is an official diagnosis. We have, people talk about porn addiction, sex addiction, where we don't really talk too much about like work addiction, right? On the other hand, I know people personally who have damaged their lives, their marriages, their kids, by overdoing it with work. But we really don't talk about work addiction as being a thing. We don't talk about religion addiction necessarily as being a thing, even though there are probably people out there that have overdone it in various ways with religiosity. So we tend to look at things that are naughty, if you will, sort of naughty behaviors that people sometimes do overdo. And we worry about those types of behaviors where we don't worry about it if people are overdoing desirable things or socially desirable things. So if you work 100 hours a week, then you're just a hard worker, even if your marriage falls apart and your health is declining and you're not a happy person. We just don't worry about that to the same extent, because it's kind of what you're supposed to do is work hard, right? It's morally desirable sort of thing. So so a lot of these things do end up being situations where we are using mental health diagnoses to kind of regulate people's moral behavior. And if people are stepping outside what we want them to do, what we expect them to do, we decide to label that a diagnosis, if you will. Now, that doesn't mean that every mental condition is like that. I mean, this is not to say there aren't real mental health conditions out there or people suffering from them, but it is to point out that diagnosing or coming up with these kind of classification systems for diagnosis can be very tricky. And there definitely is this sort of corruption or bias or inclusion of moral and social beliefs or customs into that process that can make things confusing and sometimes can hurt people.
So ultimately, as we've both, I think, agreed here, the definitions change by culture. They change in the same culture over time. There's an element of arbitrary social taboo that infects these criterion. But at the end of the day, there still ought to be a difference between mental illness and its opposite. And there has to be some rational and useful principle by which to decide what things qualify as mental illness and what things don't. I think despite everything I've been saying, I still believe that. And then the question is, what is that principle?
That's a great question. And if we really had that dividing line, we probably would have a lot less controversy in psychology and psychiatry. I mean, I think really the way people would talk about sort of the distinction between wellness and mental illness typically kind of came down to three things. And one was the sort of sense of personal distress. So how unhappy are you? Are you anxious? Are you sad? Are you depressed? Are you angry? And how persistent is that? We all experience these things occasionally, but if it's persisting and becoming interfering, then that might move you over the line. Is the behavior harmful? Are you persisting in it, despite its harmfulness? So, obviously alcoholism is a great example of that. Are you drinking alcohol might be fun, so you might not be having distress, but are you having legal problems? Are you having health problems, because of the drinking and are persisting in that kind of behavior? And the third one used to be kind of this sense of, sort of just being deviant, would be the way of putting it. And obviously that's one that's now being de-emphasized to some extent. So in other words, was your behavior just so unusual that the average person would remark upon it and think of it as being unusual? Now, in more recent years, we've kind of been de-emphasizing that criteria, again, because it can be very stigmatizing of people that are fine, they're happy, but they're just different in some respects. But even with the other two criteria, you still get into these, obviously, yes, if you're suicidal, then you probably should have a diagnosis. If you're happy as a clam, you probably shouldn't. But where is the dividing line between the two? So one of the controversies now that was a change in the DSM-5 is there used to be an exclusion that if you were going through a grief process, if a loved one died in your immediate social circle and you felt persistently sad for more than 2 weeks, that this was kind of normal. If you're a very, very close relative dies and you feel sad for a while, that's kind of humanity. Now it's diagnosable. you can be diagnosed with a major depressive episode, even though the reason why you're depressed would probably look pretty reasonable to most individuals. And so there's a lot of controversy built around things like that. Is it to people's benefit that they should be diagnosed and thus might be able to get help or at least get insurance reimbursement for that help? Or should we be thinking of these things as being pretty normal reactions and not over pathologizing them? So there still are a lot of debates about exactly where the dividing line is between a behavior that may be unpleasant, but is kind of normative versus one that really should be thought of as being a mental illness.